Please remember, the views expressed on Albertans in Space by our guests and hosts alike are opinions and do not represent the entire industry as a whole. Our podcast serves only as a platform, and all topics discussed are primarily for educational purposes only. Welcome to Albertans in Space, the series where we talk to Albertans making waves in the local and global space industry. We've got a really great episode for our audience today. Joining us is Dr. Michael Gallager, who, fun fact, was former president and CEO of Spaceflight Professionals, Inc. Dr. Gallager is going to give us his expert opinion on what future space means for humans and how we can keep them happy and healthy while exploring new worlds. I'm your host, Zach Trolley.
And I'm the co-host and planet passenger, Megan Westelmajor. Hey, Zach.
Yes, Megan.
What did the Earth make fun of the moon for?
Cannot imagine what.
Having no life.
Yeah, all right. Albertans in Space is filmed in the city of Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. This land, traditionally called Mohkinstsis, belongs to many nations and peoples who make their home here. We honor the traditions taught to us by our elders to acknowledge the generosity of Mother Earth and to take care of the land as humanity expands to new worlds.
I'm going to get serious for a second here.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I look up at the stars at night and it's really hard to believe we're the only ones here. Do you think there's life in space?
Like, you talking like extraterrestrial kind of thing?
No, yeah. I'm not necessarily talking about little green men, but there's got to be something else out there, right?
Well, the truth is out there. Yeah, well, I mean, we are looking for extraterrestrial life. The SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has been looking for life beyond Earth since it was founded in 1984. The institute mostly focuses on analyzing data from telescopes and space instruments, looking for signs of advanced life like radio waves. There was even a program called SETI at Home where you could set up your computer to crunch data while you weren't using it. All the cool kids in the 90s had that screensaver installed. I should know because I did as well. But so far, the scientists have yet to find clear evidence that would indicate there's been life beyond Earth, past or present.
What about life in our solar system?
Well, we are looking there too. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 project was sent in a two-part mission to Mars. There was the orbital mission that went on July 20th, and the lander mission launched on September 3rd. Now, the first part of the mission was to take detailed images of the surface of Mars, the planet's atmosphere, and relay communications between Earth and the Mars lander. The second part of the mission was for the lander to conduct a variety of scientific experiments to analyze the rock and soil samples, study weather and seismic activity, and to search for signs of life. The results were inconclusive.
What does that even mean?
So finding life as we know it is pretty easy because we know what to look for. If a little thing comes up and bites the camera, chances are it was alive. But looking for life that we don't know about is obviously very harder because we don't know really what we're looking for. So Viking did not find life as we know it, but some people think the data suggests there could be other forms of life in the chemistry in the Martian soil. Inconclusive.
So there's a chance that there's life on Mars.
Huge asterisks. We're going to go with maybe.
Maybe's good enough for me.
Yeah. We need to check more, though. We need to go there. We need to kick up some rocks and take a look around.
As much as I'd like to have this episode be about aliens and featuring our friends Mulder and Scully from the X-Files.
Great.
Watch it. Let's circle back to how human life can thrive in space before we can actively search for life on other planets.
So the human body is a very complex system. We're also very fragile. So who better than a doctor to come on and talk with us about what happens when we live and work in space?
How do we keep humans happy, healthy, and alive in space?
Well, I'm not a doctor, but we have one, and I'm very excited to bring in Dr. Michael Gallager today to discuss that.
Dr. Gallager was born and raised in Calgary. He pursued his undergraduate in life sciences at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, then returned to Alberta to attend medical school. He specialized in rural family medicine and completed his residency in Medicine Hat, several small towns in southern Alberta, and in Yellowknife. In 2013, he returned to Alberta, where he continued to work as a physician in Edmonton in various hospitals, clinics, and eventually at the Canadian Forces Base in Edmonton for a couple of years. On the base, he was able to receive basic and advanced training in their dive medicine courses as a civilian contractor. His lust for life and curiosity would lead the doctor to travel to the Canadian Forces in Esquimalt, BC, where he continued to practice dive medicine. Later, Dr. Gallager would go on to practice more traditional family medicine again at the Shoreline Medical Clinic in the town of Sydney in the Saanich Peninsula Hospital. Throughout his journey as a medical professional, Dr. Gallager has always had an interest in space, first spending 2 years as a flight surgeon coordinator at the Mars Society, 5 years as a member of the Aerospace Medical Association, and is the former president and CEO of the Association of Spaceflight Professionals.
That is a resume.
It's quite a mouthful.
Yeah. So Michael and I met at the 2014 Space Studies program at the International Space University. We were the only two Albertans in the program that year, and we co-authored a paper on space innovation, which was an amazing experience. And it's been cited 63 times since it was published in 2015, so I'm really proud of that.
You should be.
I am. All right, well, let's bring him on.
Welcome to Albertans in Space, Michael. Tell us about your space origin story.
When I was in medical school at University of Alberta, we all got a letter from the dean at that time, and he had said, Canadian Space Agency is looking for 3 Canadians to go do an elective at the 3 kind of main areas that NASA was doing these electives in: Kennedy Space Center, Johnson Space Center, and then the University of Texas Medical Branch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, you know, loved space for a long period of time. I did try at one point in undergraduate to do something related to space life sciences, hadn't gotten in there. I thought, well, I'll try it again. Let's see what happens. After a night of being on call and everything, I got this call from one of the people from the Canadian Space Agency, not knowing it was that person, said, hello, can I speak to Michael Gallager, please? And I thought, oh gosh, this is a spam call. This is the marketer calling. So, well,
Right.
Michael Gallagher's not here right now. And thank you very much. And I hung up, and then I got this email that said, well, I tried to call you, but I couldn't leave a message from the Canadian Space Agency, and you've ended up getting this elective to go to Kennedy Space Center. I thought, oh gosh, what have I done? And so I emailed her right back. Luckily, that all worked out, and it was, I think, one of the more formative, probably most formative parts of my career in terms of just saying, wow, I can't believe that I actually got the opportunity to do this and to see this and to be around these folks and to be around during both Space Shuttle Discovery and Space Shuttle Atlantis's activities, Space Shuttle Discovery's launch and landing, and then Space Shuttle Atlantis getting rolled out to the pad, and just meeting some very incredible human beings who work there.
I guess kind of the pitfalls of technology, right? When you have infinite communication abilities, it's hard to understand who's calling you.
I don't answer any phone numbers
Right?
I don't know.
You got to put that NASA filter in there. Oh, it's an astronaut phone. You got to better pick up.
Yeah, please answer. You've got a pretty incredible medical resume. How does space fit into that for you?
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting is that having gone into rural medicine and then having seen a little bit about how NASA works and how astronauts live and work in space and that sort of thing. I mean, there are a lot of very big similarities, I think. I mean, when you're on the space station, or if you're thinking about doing a more permanent mission to the moon, you have to think about, well, what sort of medical capabilities are you going to have there? And if you have somebody who comes in who's sick, I mean, whether you're in a small town in the Yukon, or whether you're on a moon base or whatnot, I mean, you have to really ask 3 questions. Okay, well, what am I going to do for this person with what I have here? How am I going to get them out of this location and into a location that has more people and tools that will help them with their medical issue? And who am I going to talk to get the best possible advice to provide the best possible care for them? I mean, you're not only thinking about the medical problem and what tools you have in your hospital, you're also thinking about other things like, okay, what's transport going to be like? What's the environment like? What are the hazards in that environment that could impact how you're going to get somebody to a higher level of care if you decided that you need to transport them out? There's a really very interesting similarities between space medicine and rural medicine.
So let's talk about that first level of care, that basic medicine, cuts, bruises, slips, trips and falls, strange rashes. How does that work in space? The zero gravity thing, like the basic, oh man, I should just go see a doctor about that. Whether it's zero gravity or in a lunar environment, how does that work?
Well, I think there are some things that are quite similar. I mean, the human body is similar, and there are some similarities to how a human body is going to react to illness, like cuts, scrapes, bruises, that sort of a thing. Although in space, there's a little bit higher chance of certain types of infections and that sort of a thing. So that you maybe have to be mindful of. So really in space, this is a very different environment, and how might the body be reacting differently to that? What are the things that I'm seeing in space that are a typical human reaction to that environment, and when is there something that's actually going seriously wrong?
I'm curious about like the flu, because the flu on Earth over the last few years, as we all know, has become super duper. Does the flu exist if you're going to live in space and in any space environment?
Well, I think a lot of what is done and has been done on past missions is to be able to have people kind of quarantine before they fly into space, because you really want to lower the risks of there being some kind of virus that's going to go with you up into space and is going to infect the rest of the crew. There have been some studies on certain types of bacteria and whatnot and other microbes that infect the human body, and some of those do get a little bit more virulent. Basically means that they have more of a chance of making you sick. There's some very fascinating studies, not only in humans, but in animals and in plants, about how does this environment change how this particular organism adapts to that environment. And some things are very striking.
Just as you said, the human body reacts differently in certain environments. You're saying, these viruses and bacteria would also react differently in these environments.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think I've seen many sci-fi movies about that.
With Hollywood, there's always a tad bit of that sensational aspect to it. But I mean, one thing that's always been striking is if you look at space, and maybe if you were to summarize what space does to the body, space in a sense almost makes you age really, really quickly. I mean, your bones start to get thinner much more quickly. Your muscles, can tend to get smaller, though there is, with a lot of the different exercise countermeasures, they've managed to mitigate some of that. Your balance can get a lot more affected, especially when you come back to Earth and you have to rehabilitate that. Astronauts can come back to Earth and they faint because their body's not quite as used to having to get fluids back up to their brain against gravity and that sort of a thing. The main reason for that is weightlessness. So you also think back on Earth where you're saying, well, why is it important to exercise? Why is it important to challenge your body in certain ways with your bones and muscles to let them know they're still needed and you still want them around? Space provides a very interesting example of that, where, wow, if you're not walking around and you're not having to work against gravity a little bit, that can be a problem for your body.
Going into space and, you have this crew, usually I would think each crew has some manner of training and first aid in the medical field. I mean, we know that in Alberta, being very, industry driven, a lot of folks have, they're like working at heights ticket, their H2S, different training like that. What kind of like basic training do astronauts get in like first aid in medical? What does that look like?
My understanding is that some of the training, they do spend a bit of time in hospitals learning some more basic and more advanced procedures. I did see an intubation kit. There have been some interesting studies on how might you intubate, meaning put a tube down somebody's throat to help breathe for them in a microgravity environment when you're up in weightlessness in space. What do you want to teach an astronaut to have, and what sort of basic skills should they have to be able to operate effectively in a medical environment? Probably teaching them how to take out a bowel tumor in space is probably not going to be your first priority. You do want to teach them some of those key basics that you would learn in a first aid or a CPR course. You want to teach them how to resuscitate somebody by CPR. You want to be able to teach them how they might breathe for someone. You probably want to teach them some of the basics about how do you start an IV, how do you give fluids. Intubation's an interesting one. I always wonder, and this is something I don't know, I'm thinking, okay, well, how are you going to, after you've intubated somebody, you're going to evacuate them on something as small as the Soyuz. How are you going to bag them on their way down through reentry? What are you going to do?
Right.
I don't have the answer to that. And I'd love it if somebody ever, was to explain to me why they decided to include that in the medical kit. The reason why you teach first aid is like, okay, what are those key high impact things that you can do to save someone's life, or at least get them to the next stage where somebody else can help save their life. If you're coming from low Earth orbit back to when they were using the Soyuz to Kazakhstan, or now with a lot of the SpaceX flights back into the ocean to where they're retrieved and then coming back.
I mean, we think about that if we go out to, take a trip to Banff, or like you said, in a rural setting, how are we going to get somewhere with a hospital? Yeah, if you're in a splint in a reentry capsule, that's going to be a rough reentry on your way back.
Yeah. Well, and that's so much where the environment then starts to take so much precedence. I think it would actually be really interesting to have more medical students exposed to the space environment, because you really do have to think on your feet. You have to anticipate certain things you wouldn't have thought of. For example, CPR. CPR on Earth, you lay somebody on the ground or have them on the table, and then you start pressing on their chest.
Yeah.
But if that person's floating, well, what do? Do you give them a bear hug and then try and do CPR that way?
Right.
Do you position yourself as the space capsule, a round space capsule? Can you put your feet on one end and put the person on the other end? Do you do CPR this way? Right. And if you look at intubation, well, that's a whole new dynamic. Somebody's lying on a flat surface sometimes to be able to put a tube down somebody's throat successfully. Well, if that person's floating and moving all over the place, well, what are you going to do there? So there are some very fascinating things about space and activities in space that make you think differently and make you say, okay, what are tried and true things you should stick with, and what are things where you should say, okay, wait a second, we need to significantly adjust the playbook in terms of how we're going to approach a situation like this compared with on Earth.
When we do CPR, we do training here on Earth, we usually get the Bee Gees, Staying Alive song. Is there a different song that we need to use in our heads for space? It's the same song?
I think it's the same song.
Okay.
Classic.
Good to know.
Staying alive works wherever you are. Sometimes when you're thinking about a different environment, you think not only what's new, but what's the same. Because sometimes you can get oh my God, I'm in space. I can't, everything's different. I can't possibly do anything. And so you can get kind of that paralysis by analysis.
Right.
So let's take it back to basics. Okay, their heart isn't beating. You need to help pump blood around the circulation. That's the same in space as it is on Earth. Start there and move forward.
How is it like to have, your full-time job as an MD, and this passion for space and fusing them together? Is there something that you take with you every day when you go to work that inspires you to think about space and vice versa? Like how it affects your full-time job as a doctor?
A lot of that, what we covered about rural medicine is probably one of the key things. I think there was somebody who said one time, wow, we put somebody on the moon, but this walker isn't, how can we not design a better walker?
People say that to me all the time, like, this machine doesn't work, but we put someone on the moon.
I've had one foot in that world. And so it's nice to be able to say, okay, well, how are they thinking about these problems? Getting somebody to walk versus putting somebody on the moon does come back to coaching around lifestyle and the importance of saying, hey, look, do what you can to help your body help itself. And also, hey, did you know this is what can tend to happen to astronauts when they're not exercising as much? There was one study presented by somebody working at the University of Alberta that saw the beginnings of osteoarthritis in the joints of astronauts. People almost think of getting the kind of, we almost call it the wear and tear arthritis, osteoarthritis. They go, wow, I'm moving too much. My joints are getting achy and tired and that sort of a thing. But it's a really interesting lesson to say, well, joints actually like to move. They just don't like to be moved way too much so that they're wrenched and you tear, some of the cartilage in your joints. But they also really don't like to just be sitting in front of the TV either. If you're weightless and your joints maybe aren't moving, maybe there's something to be said for that causing some additional problems. And so that's a nice way to kind of illustrate to patients to say, well, hey, here's an example of how joints might like to move. Astronauts do exercise in space and they run on the treadmill and that sort of a thing. So I'd be interested to know the state of that research now.
We've had about 500 or so people go into space and be in this microgravity environment.
Mhm.
A dozen or so land on the moon and be in 1/6 gravity. What do we know about the space environment, the radiation and gravity and how that affects the body? You mentioned aging faster, but what does that mean? What happens to us when we're up there?
Sure. So that very much is the bones kind of getting a little bit thinner. Now, some of that they've by doing certain types of exercise, and there's a new machine called the fairly new machine called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device has done a lot to correct that problem of bone loss. But you have to work very, very hard to maintain your bone and muscle. And certainly as you age, you do start to see decreases in bone. I mean, in the past, astronauts lose as much bone in 1 month as a postmenopausal woman, a woman after menopause would lose in a year. A lot of folks, as they age, start to get issues with their balance. Well, certainly in space, and you're in an environment where your body's having difficulty kind of understanding which way is up and then transitioning back to an Earth-based environment. Astronauts can be very, very unsteady. It often takes a lot of rehabilitation to get better at that. Certainly, there are a lot of folks who age who can have problems with feeling quite faint, whether they're on medications or heart problems or whatnot. Astronauts is less used to having to keep fluid going up more towards your head. So when you get back to Earth, that's a bit of a shock to your body, and so you can feel that dizziness and feeling like you're about to faint. The medical term is called orthostatic hypotension. Going to space makes you age.
Do cuts heal slower or faster when you're in a space environment?
Oh, good question. One thing that can happen more often in space are skin infections, and there are a variety of reasons for that. From that perspective, my guess might be maybe about the same, but if you get a bit of an infection, then that can obviously slow things down and cause some complications.
So I know this is not probably your area of expertise, but talking about mental health, what are the types of things that astronauts do to prepare themselves for these long journeys and being in close spaces and having aging quicker, maybe not so great for astronauts' mental health? Do you know too much about what kind of training they go through before they go to space?
Well, there was one thing that I'd heard about that astronauts do tend to do with their families, so they know, because being an astronaut is a very dangerous job compared to a lot of other occupations. And so something that I have heard that people do is they actually go through a scenario with their families where they actually rehearse a situation in which that astronaut has died from something in space. And so they actually go through that to say, okay, well, how can I prepare for that eventuality? In Chris Hadfield's book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, there was a very interesting chapter called Sweat the Small Stuff. And what was really neat about that with regards to maybe calming certain things that could be fears or anxieties about going to space, it was that if you've prepared and sweated out every single eventuality for what might go on, or as many of them as you can possibly go through, then when it comes time to launch the space shuttle, you say, well, okay, well, I guess I have to launch the space shuttle now. And you have less of that uncertainty and less of that doubt and anxiety that kind of goes through your minds. Having good contact with family members that astronauts rely on. I think there is a session where astronauts can talk with their flight surgeons about how they're feeling in space and if there's anything kind of mentally that's becoming a problem for them. But certainly, yeah, isolation, being in a dangerous environment potentially. We've seen on prior missions, sometimes there's uncertainty about when you're going to go back and everything and resupply and whatnot. And so, I mean, there are a lot of things that you have to do. And I think there's also a lot that's focused on when you pre-select an astronaut to go to space. I mean, there's a lot that people look to say, okay, well, how do we make sure that folks who are going to go into this environment have the resilience to be able to be in that environment and be successful in that environment?
I think it's really key, and you mentioned preparing people for the likelihood that the worst case scenario might happen. We don't, as a community, we don't necessarily talk about death very much, but talking about it, preparing for it, I think is so important that we need to be talking about more just in general. So I'm really happy to hear that that happens, even though it's a difficult conversation. It's important for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
As we push boundaries, that's bound to happen. And I think in our massively connected world, we've kind of forgot that what that might be like to lose connection with somebody. A few hundred years ago, if someone traveled to the other side of the world, that might be the last time you see them. Right now, you just call them up. So we've gotten used to that. As we start going further and further out, we're going to get back into that. How are we taking space tech? And when can the average person see that come into their lives, or are they doing it already?
Well, I mean, something that is a very key thing that we almost never think about now is GPS. I
Right.
mean, that relies on a huge network of satellites all around the world that is able to tell us very clearly where we are. So if somebody falls down a ski hill and they're maybe in the backcountry. Well, many years ago, we wouldn't have had that a few folks it would have been fairly expensive to have that sort of technology, but ordinary folks wouldn't have had that capability necessarily to say, this is where I am, come get me here. Now it's you carry almost everyone has a cell phone in their pocket that they can very easily say, okay, here's where I am. If you're in cell range, you can call emergency service and say, okay, this is where I am. I fell down here. I'm right here, and then someone can come get you. So I think that's shortened the time to be able to have an emergency response come to pick you up if you get into trouble in an area in the wilderness in Alberta.
We don't even think about that now. It's a standard feature, right? But I think it was in the 70s where it was declassified. Before then, it was hope you're really good at orienteering.
Yeah,
I can't imagine like being the first people to go down a ski hill and get covered by an avalanche. Like they would never be found again.
Well, I remember, Zach, when you and I did that one program at ISU, I remember Scott Madry saying at one point to an interviewer, he said, a day without space would be a very bad day.
Absolutely.
There are so many aspects of space. There's so many aspects of space that have worked our way into our everyday lives that in some ways we just don't even think about it now. But if
we
it
don't
was
know.
wrong,
People don't
if
know.
we had a solar storm and that knocked out a bunch of satellites, that would be a very, very bad day.
Very bad day.
So thank your local scientist and engineer.
Yeah, give them a hug. Give them a high five if they don't like hugs.
Yeah.
What kind of advice would you give new grads of medical school that were interested in space, either in Alberta or across Canada?
I'm going to probably borrow a little bit from Jell Lindgren, who gave a great talk to the Aerospace Medical Association Students and Residents Organization. Space medicine is a very small part of another very small part of medicine. Basically, you've got kind of a field called occupational medicine. And then within that, you've kind of got aerospace medicine. The main activity for that is in the military. And then you have space medicine, which is an even smaller kind of portion of that. So a lot of what people have often said with getting into space medicine as well, try and develop an expertise in a more traditional type of medicine first, and then bring that expertise with you to space medicine. I think getting to Jell Lindgren's talk, one thing he told us a little bit more about was his story becoming an emergency physician. And he'd always really wanted to be an astronaut. But what he'd said was, I've got this amazing opportunity to be an emergency physician, and I have this sort of dream to be an astronaut. But right now, I have this opportunity to be an emergency physician, so I'm going to be the best possible emergency physician that I can be right now. And I'm going to put all my energy to that. And he said, well, and then I happen to have this amazing opportunity come up that I'd worked for to become an astronaut. And then he said, well, more recently, I was trying to maintain my clinical practice, was trying to continue to be a good astronaut. And he said, I've finally had to realize, well, geez, if I want to be a really good astronaut, I've kind of got to give up my clinical practice. And he gave a great quote. He said, look, I can be a great dad, a great astronaut, or a great doctor, and I can maybe do one, maybe two of those things if
Right.
I want to do them well. Try and learn something in the medical field that you're wanting to go into on Earth. Keep involved. If that opportunity comes up, then bring what you've learned into that field. We're a smaller country, smaller population. We do have a great space agency that many say punches above its weight.
Mm-hmm.
Have to be a bit crafty to be involved in space in Canada, to kind of say, okay, well, is there something that I'm doing that's very much aligned with what the Canadian Space Agency is interested in? If so, great. But part of the reason the Canadian Space Agency, I think, punches above its weight is it said, okay, well, here are very key things that we can do well, that Canada's naturally suited to doing, and that Canada needs for its own national activities. And I think that's part of why it's been successful. So if you're kind of saying, well, I have an interest in something that maybe doesn't quite align with the Canadian Space Agency, well, there is this new kind of burgeoning commercial space industry. So that does allow you to be a little bit more crafty in terms of how you approach your activities in space. And perhaps if you have something be very useful to the space industry, well, that might be an interesting route for you to go while maintaining some core skills in your Earth-based occupation.
And we've talked about that before, that if you want to get involved in space, it's more than just being an astronaut. And there's lots and lots of things that you can do about space. And the best thing you can do is bring your passion forward, right? Take something you love doing, that you're good at, that you've cultivated, and bring that to space. And have you worked somewhat in the commercial space sphere, right?
A little bit. Well, and so I tried to be a bit crafty as well. And so that was with some of my work as a former president and CEO of Association of Spaceflight Professionals. So that was a really neat opportunity to kind of learn a little bit more about. I mean, I thought, well, hey, look, maybe there would be some interesting ways that we could use some ideas for technology that might be needed in space, but also technologies that might be needed in rural communities. So I was very interested in working with some student teams out of the University of Toronto on looking at their design for an auto transfusion device that might be able to take, if somebody came into your rural hospital and they were bleeding, well, you could maybe take some of that blood and then actually retransfuse it back into their body. And currently, the devices that do that, you often find in either very big emergency departments, or you would find in surgical suites and that sort of a thing. And so the thought was, well, hey, student team, is there a way that you might be able to make that smaller and simpler and make that usable by somebody in a rural community? Having some of those opportunities to do that was very interesting, and a way to keep involved in space and to do something useful that way. So if you are in medicine, you're a medical student or resident, or you finished formal training, then you can do a course called the University of Texas Medical Branch's Principles of Aviation Space Medicine short course for a month. And that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what space medicine is like. And then you could do what Zach and I did, which was a really neat way to connect with people in different disciplines in space. Who are the different people that are involved in making exploration happen? What are the skills that they bring to the field?
Right.
And how are they interfacing with one another to make this possible?
So, Michael, there are commercial space sports popping up. I've seen a few for Canada, even they're going to put out. Do we see a future where Dr. Michael Gallager is going to be a flight surgeon on Canadian soil?
Good question. Well, I mean, I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I mean, there are a lot of amazing folks who are currently staffing the Canadian Space Agency very well in that regard, and I think there are a lot of folks knocking at their doors. So that would be an incredible opportunity if that ever came up. What I'm most excited about in space is actually seeing more people be able to go. you're so right that there are a lot of different people that need to be involved in space, especially in the past. There's only been a select few people who've been able to go, and I think that really gives a lot of us a lot of hope that, hey, look, yes, you can be involved in the space sector, and also one day that chance that you'll be able to fly is getting greater and greater. And I do think that the more folks from different areas who are able to actually fly in space, I do think there will be an acceleration of how much more we can do in space, because I mean, people bring very unique and interesting perspectives from their work. I mean, I talked with somebody in Saskatchewan who talked about first aid training they did in places in enclosed spaces, because that can often be very important in oil and gas work. I mean, if a person who's done that then starts to fly, well, will they go farther in space? That next step that we thought was maybe not possible right now becomes possible.
So if we have any oil and gas professionals with a long list of safety tickets, keep those in your back pocket. You'd be flying to space one day. Well, Michael, we have a little bit on here that we like to do. It is our Albertas in Space book club. We're going to put our book club hats on.
Over our headphones.
Over our headphones here. And we'd love to hear, your book choice, something that inspired you, that speaks to you, that reflects kind of, where you're at right now, or a favorite. What is your book you want to add to the Alberta in Space book club?
Well, one I really enjoyed was Waiting for First Light by Romeo Dallaire. That was, I mean, I think on that theme of mental health and about being able to talk about mental health. And I think it was a very courageous book that he wrote. And I've seen him a few times giving various lectures and everything. I mean, he really went into a very intimate portrayal about how his experience in Rwanda affected him for a long period of time, and some very visceral details of what happened. And I think we have been afraid to talk about mental health and just the types of people that can be affected by it. And I think even somebody who was a very high performing person in the Canadian military, there were things that just happened that affected him very deeply. One thing in terms of how that's affected me at work and with some of my past work with the Canadian Forces is to say, okay, well, wow, there are some very hard things that people have gone through, but there can be some light at the end of the tunnel. And my job as a physician is to help people as much as possible through that dark period in their lives in whatever way that would benefit them. It was a very important firsthand account of what it was like faced with an unbelievably difficult and impossible circumstance from every perspective, whether it was bureaucratic, whether it was viscerally just seeing the consequences of that in action on thousands and thousands of people around him, that he was not able to act.
I think that conversation of mental health is extremely important. We don't know what's going to happen to the human mind, the human body, while we stay in space for a year, for 10 years. When we have generations in space, we have no idea what that's going to be. I think it was actually the very first episode of The Twilight Zone was about loneliness. It was a simulation on what would it be like on a person being alone in space. Like, what does that psychological effect have? So, thinking of these things is extremely important. It's not all about the gears and widgets and wires. People are the biggest unknown in this.
When I've gone to several different aerospace conferences and whatnot, that there is some talk about saying this is a very important thing to consider, mental health and psychological well-being, and it's very important to figure out how are we going to support folks through that. And you mentioned isolation. Well, absolutely. If you're going to Mars, you're in a tin can with the same people for a very long period of time, with maybe sometimes not a whole lot to do.
Yeah.
There'll be moments of high operational tempo and intensity, but there'll also probably be times when you're transiting between Earth and Mars
just waiting.
You might be. I mean, maybe you'll be doing some studies on various stars you're seeing around you, and you might be sending back data, but maybe there'll be also times of just abject boredom.
I think about people getting along. And so then there's that aspect. There's just layers and layers of that issue. And hopefully the more we learn, the more we send people up there and we're getting this data back, we can start preparing people for dealing with difficult people, dealing with mental health, loneliness, and also the physical body and how to deal with a deteriorating body, which can affect your mental health as well.
Yeah. Well, and that I think is another huge part of pre-selection, which is okay, well, is this person going to fit well with the rest of the crew who are going to go up? I think there was someone I'd talked to kind of in space circles that said, well, one key thing in an interview question with a prospective astronaut candidate is, okay, could I spend 6 months in a tin can with this person?
I remember some studies in some of the analog missions saying that you require someone to be the Joker. There has to be someone in the group that's basically does just lift spirits in some way or fashion. And without that, I mean, a 6-month road trip with no jokes, that's going to be rough.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us here on Albertans in Space. It was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for tuning into Albertans in Space. We hope you enjoyed the show today.
And a big thank you to Dr. Michael Gallager for spending time talking with us about what living in space would do to the human body and how eventually we can live and work happy and healthy in space. Please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us a like. We appreciate your support. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at albertansinspace_podcast.
And if you're interested in learning more about the Spaceflight Professionals and what they're all about, go to spaceflightprofessionals.org and Spaceflight Professionals on YouTube. Massive kudos to Sandra Lynn for her writing and research efforts, James, our sound engineer, 6 Degrees Music and Sound, Dan, our DOP camera, and Kristen, our behind-the-scenes photographer, for helping us make this podcast sound and look amazing.
Next time on Albertans in Space, we speak with Dr. Shauna Pandya, an astronaut and doctor, about space medicine technologies and going to space. You won't want to miss it.
Bye for now.